today. As Mark mentioned, this is the first in a series of Hot Topics webinars that we're going to be hosting as part of the NERC-funded Integrating Nature, Finance, and Biodiversity Research Program, or IFB for short. Mark, Hannah, and I work within one of the three themes within the program, the UK Nations and International Collaboration theme, which aims to highlight and share emerging policies, good practice developments, and other biodiversity knowledge emerging both from within the 4 UK nations as well as more broadly internationally. So the Hot Topics webinar series is intended to stimulate discussion on emerging trends and initiatives. So we've really reserved a lot of time today within the hour for us to have a good Q&A and hopefully stimulate some discussion today. So today, we are joined by 2 of our research partners within the IFB program. We have Franziska Schrodt from University of Nottingham, and she's leading the IFB program theme for data, tools, and metrics, with a focus on assessing the biodiversity data requirements and infrastructure needs of stakeholders. As part of this, Franzi is collaborating with the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures to devise principles of high integrity and effectiveness. And also with us today is Richard Field from the University of Nottingham, and he's leading one of the 3 IFB program flagships, which focuses on financing biodiversity. The goal of that flagship is to define what high integrity finance for biodiversity should look like and what the barriers and opportunities are to deliver high integrity approaches. So both Franzi and Richard served as technical co-leads of the work group that developed the newly released framework for high integrity biodiversity credit markets, and they are here today to tell you more about it. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Franzi and Richard.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us. We are looking forward to the discussions and the questions from the audience. So I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully you can see that. Yes, okay, good. So we are going to start by just introducing the general background to biodiversity credits a little bit, then the process we went through to derive the design criteria, and then Richard will take you into a few more details on the criteria themselves. So the motivation behind developing biodiversity credits is quite a broad one, really. So maybe down to 3 main drivers. One of them is that huge finance gap for biodiversity conservation and protection that has been identified as being about $1 trillion in the latest analysis by Bloomberg. Another one is international commitments. There are a few of them. The latest one is the 30 by 30, so conserving 30% of land and seas, which again calls for stronger and better designation of protected areas, but also increase of protection of biodiversity globally. And then finally, on the industry side, strong recognition that many supply chains really depend on biodiversity inherently, and so operations of many businesses are at risk unless biodiversity can be maintained. Recent analysis done by another member of the IFB, Nicola Ranger, and her team, for example, identified a 12% risk of agricultural output to pollinator decline. So the demand drivers are definitely there. They are from multinational corporations, SMEs, financial institutions, including banks and also insurances, philanthropists, governments, and also individuals. So a broad range of demand drivers related to the motivations I mentioned in the last slide, but also more expectations and requirements that are put onto businesses particularly. So one is down to stakeholder expectations. A lot of consumers nowadays really put a lot of value on businesses showing that they are green in some way, whether that's related to carbon and climate or to biodiversity. but they're also increasing a number of regulatory and compliance requirements put onto businesses operating in the UK and Europe, but also more broadly across the world. Some of them are voluntary, such as the recommendations of the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, but there are also some regulatory ones, such as the EU CSRD directive that has just come into force and Biodiversity Net Gain in the UK. And the second demand driver is to have stronger targets and demonstrate progress against those targets. So, for example, under the science-based targets networks, but also in line with the global biodiversity framework. So what are biodiversity credits? There are a few definitions out there, but the one that is really broadly accepted is the one by the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. As a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what have otherwise occurred. So there are a lot of aspects in here that we will dissect a little bit more later on. And use cases identified are evidence-based contributions to nature goals, whether that's compliance or regulatory-based or voluntary, local compensation of biodiversity impacts, but only following the mitigation hierarchy, so under very strict criteria, and then insetting or proactive investment in biosupply chains. So how big is this kind of biodiversity credit market currently? So here's a slightly outdated analysis by the Climate Collective. On the left-hand side, apologies, it's very small, but just to outline the scope of this, there are a few a global map here of some of the stronger and better established initiatives. Again, there are a lot more now. We have private sector-led programs, government-led programs, governance or integrity initiatives, university-led programs, and then also independent standards. Projections range widely of the kind of value and financial input that could be generated through this mechanism. So the inevitable policy response in 2020 estimated a potential of 18 to 43 billion US dollars in revenue generated from those biodiversity credits, and Bloomberg estimated about 160 billion by 2030. The current status, as estimated by Pollination this year, looks quite variable, so between 300,000 and almost 2 million US dollars. Having been sold to date, and that translates into 26,000 to 125,000 hectares. So substantial, but still much below the kind of estimates of the potential for this framework. Some of this is down to there being still no clear guidance until now on what really constitutes high integrity markets and biodiversity measurements. And that's because biodiversity is incredibly complicated. The MRV could go from any of those factors that are listed here, so ecosystems, taxons, species, populations. A lot of them include drivers. Some include baselines or reference site. It could be based on measured, inferred, or modeled data and insight. So it's a wide range of aspects that have to be considered. Within the IAPB, we did a landscape analysis that we also combined with the analysis published by Wunder et al. Earlier this year. And we looked at 16 credit methodologies in more detail, and I just give you a few details here just to illustrate the issue. So when we analyzed those credit methodologies, we looked at the potential of offsetting within those frameworks and the two regulatory initiatives, specifically target offsetting, so that's their main aim. Three methods mention the possibility, but don't go into detail. Four actively reject offsetting, and the others don't really specify whether their method is suitable for offsetting or not. Another aspect is around additionality, which again is one of the key aspects that need to be considered as part of the definition of a biodiversity credit. And again, we see quite a range here. So in 11% of the methods, it was undescribed, 11% had a mix, 24% it was action-based, and 54% were outcome-based, where actually a demonstration of positive biodiversity outcome was required. Another aspect that is important to consider and differs widely amongst those credit methodologies is whether credits are released before or after measured outcomes. So before would be ex ante, after would be ex post. And you can see that most of them only release after the biodiversity outcome has been demonstrated, but there's still quite a mix amongst those methods. And then finally around measurement, again, really wide mix here. Some of them only call for assessment of species-based measured, some only on pressure indicators, some have a mix, some don't really describe in detail what is required and so on. So basically, there's a really wide range of different methodologies out there that don't aim to do the same thing necessarily, and that don't ask for the same kind of biodiversity measurements. So quickly going to IAPB, which has been formed in 2023 by the French and UK governments. And the aim was to bring some light into this, frankly, mess of biodiversity credit methodologies and outline some guidance on what constitutes credible, timely, and coherent methods that could be also included in policy and regulatory mechanisms. It's made out of a panel of co-chairs and 25 panel members, 5 working groups, more than 100 experts coming together within them, some knowledge partners, and then also a much wider network of more than 600 members from different sectors and backgrounds. And so the working groups are on measurement, demand, supply, stewardship, and governance. Richard and I were technical co-leads of the measurement working group, so we focus mainly on our work within that today. And then just to mention the knowledge partners are also very broad and from a global background, including different centers, museums, NGOs, and so on. So the process that went into those coming up with those design criteria were based on within the IAPB measurement working group regular meetings that we had for over a year, 2 in-person meetings to really go into the detail of some of the more controversial aspects that Richard will mention later on. We also did this comprehensive analysis of existing biodiversity credit methodologies to make sure that what we did was relevant to what has already been designed in the market. And we came up with 10 different versions of the design criteria, integrating different rounds of feedback and revision before we came up with the final version. And for that, we received 12 written feedbacks on the draft report from different relevant contexts, including from industry, indigenous communities, data providers, academia, NGOs, and so on. We also ran a comprehensive online feedback on the criteria and had 3 additional workshops on 2 aspects that we found particularly tricky to address, including on additionality. And so just to highlight that the IAPB has produced a number of outputs that might be of interest to you, but today we focus mainly on the design criteria that we developed as part of the measurement working group, and then we also briefly refer to the framework that kind of integrates across the different working groups. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Francie. I'm hoping my voice holds up. I may have to mute and cough a bit, so apologies in advance if that happens. Yeah, next slide, thank you. So we've mentioned, or Francie and I think Julia both mentioned the IAPB framework, and then there's also the design criteria from the measurement group. So I think I just wanted to distinguish slightly. The IAPB itself is, well, you can look on the website, there's 20 odd members of it. which don't include me and Francie. So that's, if you like, the top panel. So our role was to be technical co-leads in the measurement working group. Now, we did comment on and help develop the framework, but the framework is really a production from the panel, the main panel. So I'll spend just this slide talking about some of the aspects of the framework, so dipping into that a little bit. And we can take some questions on that, but just beware that we were only sort of side players in that aspect of things. And then we were very much involved, as Francie's outlined, in the measurement working group, which developed the design criteria. And so if you look on the IAPB website, I think, actually, Francie, can you just go to the previous, that's it, yeah. So just to, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but to illustrate that there are various different working papers and publications from the IAPB, just go to their website. Some of it's under resources. I think the framework is under a higher level heading. But the different working groups are, so we've got highlighted the measurement one, which is the one we're focusing on more here. There's also a demand, a supply, and a governance and stewardship working paper. So it's 4 working papers up there, in addition to the main framework, which is depicted on the left here. And then there's also some other IAPB publications also shown there. So the focus here really is a little bit on the framework, the main framework, and then mostly on the measurement thing. Now, the main framework took quite a bit of inspiration from something that actually Francie and I have also been heavily involved in, which is the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. So as part of the University of Nottingham, or as the representatives of the University of Nottingham, we are on the task force of the BCA, as it's known. And the BCA really was what I would say initiated the thought about some high-level principles, which we'll show in a moment. But they became a joint exercise between the World Economic Forum working group that we're also in and the IAPB. So they were, the high-level principles were launched in Cali, or soft launched, I'll come on to in a moment, in Cali as a joint activity between the three, the World Economic Forum, the IAPB and the BCA. And then the design criteria that I'll speak more about were just an IAPB thing. Now, in the framework, so the IAPB's, if you like, headline document, there's this depiction here shown about a biodiversity credit project life cycle. And again, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I think it can be quite helpful to just, and this is the idea of it as well, is to have this illustration as it's not intending to be completely comprehensive, so it doesn't necessarily fit every single use case, but as a kind of example of a credit life cycle. This gives an idea from inception, project design through to retirement, with all the validation, verification, and some of the considerations in between. So that's figure 4 in the framework if you want to look at it in more detail. If you can skip to the next bit. And then I mentioned the high-level principles, so they figure heavily in the framework. And there's 21, I think, if I remember, and they're presented under 3 main headings. There is some debate about whether they're the most appropriate headings. But they basically focus on these, basically on verified outcomes from nature. So Francie's touched on that already a bit. That it's really important that as part of the principles for high integrity credits, you actually do get good evidence that there has been positive contribution to biodiversity. But then there's a lot of principles around equity and fairness, things like free, informed, and prior consent. Yeah, probably a good time to skip to the next bit to fill up the slide. Thank you. Yep. So this unpacks them a little bit more, and the 3 main headings, but some extra subcategories, and actually just lists the 21 high-level principles that are in there. And then the other major category is the good governance, which focuses a lot on transparency, data sovereignty, alignment, and so on. So it's really important issues for any credit. So those high-level principles, if you can go to the next slide, please, Francie, were launched in Cali. So this is the rather small pavilion or tent in Cali that was allocated. It was half the size of the one that was requested. And the one that was requested, which was about 150 capacity, would not have been enough. So there was actually a lot of interest at COP16 So this is showing, you can see a few of the figures actually. Bottom left, as Sandy showed, with sort of facing away from us. She's she's actually an IAPB secretariat. She's at DEFRA. We can see a few others. Sam Lacey, her head turned away, was kind of introducing it. She's at Biodiversity Consultancy. Kane Blythe from Credit Nature, and a number of others involved. But then most of the people here they wanted to come and listen, see this soft launch of the high-level principles. So it was everyone packed in like sardines, and you could just about make out people queuing outside the doors. And loads of people just saw that they couldn't get near the doors and walked away. So there was a lot of interest. And the same applies. There was a launch a few days later also at Cali of the design criteria and the IAPB framework, so the IAPB aspect. And it was similarly, it was a bigger venue, but it was similarly packed out. There were a lot of interest at Cali in both the high-level principles and the IAPB framework and design criteria. So next slide, please. So these are now moving on to the design criteria. So just to refresh, this is the document that was produced, if you like, the working paper from the measurement working group. So this is where Francie and I were the technical co-leads. So we had a lot to do with this. And we're best placed to answer questions on these, but we can take wider questions as well. So the design criteria document are focused on 6 main design criteria. The first 2 shown here. The other 4 will be on the next slide, but we'll stay here for the moment. You'll be glad to know I'm not reading through all of this in detail, but I'm just going to pick some bits out. So the first main criterion is all about validation and verification and assurance. And there was an awful lot of debate about whether this should be the first one or the last one, because if you like, you could come at the end once everything else is designed, then you need to make sure it's all assured and everything. But in the end, we end up putting it first because it sort of underlies everything else. So everything needs to be really well assured. And probably something like half the document is, a 40-odd page document is devoted to talking about assurance, how it's done best, validation and so on, verification. And it includes things like so VVB is a validation and verification body. There aren't many yet in this space, but there's a lot in the carbon credit world. And there's been a lot of problems with validation and verification in carbon credits in the carbon market. But we can apply good practice criteria from elsewhere to try to learn from that and improve things here. So things like proper independence. And so payment isn't tied to the results of the validation. So you don't have incentives to pass something because otherwise you don't get paid. The notion of rotation, so that through a project lifetime, there should be more than one validation body involved. So you can't just have one corrupt or whatever body, but if there's at least 2 involved through a project life cycle, then that adds a little bit more confidence for the market and so on. So there's an awful lot of emphasis on this assurance and validation aspect of things. It's also worth mentioning the 2 columns here in the middle and on the right. So we decided it was good to define must-have elements and nice-to-have elements, so that for high integrity, you absolutely must have things in the middle, and then it would also be good to have the things that are on the right-hand side. And in some cases, at least, the nice-to-haves are there because it's a recognition that they're hard to achieve. Ideally, they would be must-haves, but particularly when it comes to some of the scientific measurements, it can be prohibitively expensive. So the idea is they're more aspirational. So the second main design criterion is about if you like, the design of the measurement itself. And one of the things, to pick up a little bit on what Francie mentioned earlier briefly, you can measure actions. So we've got a nice to have here is measuring actions, and you can measure outputs or results, or you can measure both. And the key things here are there's different risks and incentives involved. So actions is like the management actions for a project site. You can do all the things you're supposed to do, but biodiversity might not follow because it's not only affected by the management actions on the site. So people who are developing biodiversity projects tend to like measurement of actions because if they do the right thing, they get paid and there's no element of risk. But people investing in biodiversity want to know that the biodiversity has actually been uplifted, so they'd rather pay for results, for verified biodiversity uplift or avoided loss. And so you can have measurements that measure the actions done, and you can have measurements that measure the actual biodiversity outcomes. And we have in there that the outcome, you absolutely must have outcome-based measures. It would also be nice to have action-based. So you can have a mix. You can, for instance, have part payment for actions and then part payment for results. So there's a lot of detail around that, but I won't go into that now. We can pick up in discussion if we need to. We can go to the next slide. Criterion 4 is sort of similar to 2, but it goes into a bit more detail about the actual measurements and the types of metrics involved. And to pick out their ecosystem state measurement should be part of it, as well as more kind of taxon-based measurements. And I'll emphasize here as well, when people are looking at impacts and dependencies and so on from a commercial point of view, the focus is usually on ecosystem services. But we felt it was important that biodiversity credits should be looking at biodiversity itself as well. And biodiversity itself, we can see as part of kind of global infrastructure. So it's less tied to immediate services and so on. And we can think of it almost as an insurance. So the more biodiversity is, the more perhaps future impacts are accounted for, and we have a lower chance of disasters if small amounts of biodiversity are affected by some major disaster. So we've got built in there quite a lot of stuff about actually measuring biodiversity and not just ecosystem services. Criterion 3 looks at things like risk sharing and default mechanisms, risk assessments, insurance, those kinds of things as being important for a credit market to work. And it picks up on this thing about whether the payments could be ex ante or ex post. Francie, actually, if you can just go to the next slide and then we'll come back to this one. So there's a little scheme here, which I think is quite helpful about the differences between ex ante and ex post, and actually two different types of ex post depending when the payment happens. And looking at it from both the issuer's perspective and from the buyer's perspective. But I think Francie quite well covered the differences. So again, we can come back to this slide if we want to, but it's table 2 in the design criteria document. So if we can just go back to the previous slide. The 5th criterion is all about transparency and publication of everything. So more or less should be self-explanatory, I think. I'll just note the bit about close collaboration with local academics and researchers. So there's an emphasis on working with local experts as much as possible. And then the final one is about additionality and things like leakage. So actually being able to, and this has been one of the big problems with the carbon market, is questions over additionality. So questions over whether the investment has actually produced any difference over what would have happened otherwise. So there's a whole set of criteria and considerations about how you determine additionality for biodiversity projects and biodiversity credits. Yeah, Francie, if you can skip to the next, and then the next one, thank you. Yeah. So I've covered quite a lot of this already, but just picking out a few of the key controversies that may seed some of the discussion. We haven't actually mentioned offsetting, or sorry, we have mentioned offset, haven't mentioned stacking and bundling. I'll just quickly talk about the on offsetting, because this is very controversial. So some people are very pro offsetting, some people are completely opposed, and there's many people in between. So this is basically, I guess people probably know what offsetting is, but briefly, it's about promoting biodiversity in a different place to where biodiversity impacts were. So you have biodiversity impact and you offset it by working somewhere else to improve the biodiversity there. And yeah, there was a lot of discussion about whether offsetting should be allowed and so on. And in the end, the IAPB just took the perspective, we're not going to try and prescribe on that, because we know some people are very in favor and some people are against. We'll basically say, if offsetting happens, then these are key considerations, but you may not allow it in your own scheme or in your own perspective. And it tends to talk more about compensation, so being specific about how biodiversity impacts are compensated elsewhere. So I put a few quotations in from the document about compensation, about offsetting. which give you a flavour for how that's dealt with in the design criteria document. Additionality and leakage, I think I covered a bit already. Additionality. Leakage is really about where, perhaps, for an example, if you have a biodiversity project that conserves an area, you can have people who perhaps would have had biodiversity impacts in that area who instead, because that area has been protected, have impacts in a nearby area that they wouldn't have necessarily used otherwise. So it's kind of shifting the problem, this issue. So that's an example of leakage. And that needs, basically, the key considerations that needs to be considered, quantified, managed as much as possible in a high integrity market. So you don't just want to be shifting problems around, you want to be trying to solve them. I've covered the rest of it, so I think we can move to the last slide. Oh, sorry, that's just a definition. There's a nice glossary. I think both documents have got a glossary, both the framework and the design criteria document. That's the IAPB's definition of compensation in this case. But I'm not going to read it out. Again, we can come back to it if we want. So if we can go to the next slide. And then the last bit here is really, where do we go from here? So these documents have been, both the high-level principles and the IAPB documents have been published. Cali COP16 was a big kind of target, which was sort of hit. I mentioned that the high-level principles were soft launched there because they're actually still out for, or there's another round of consultation, public consultation on those. So if you like, the proper hard launch for those is in Davos at the World Economic Forum next month. But they had this soft launch in Cali. So yeah, I think we're looking at the principles and the design criteria as a journey. So we haven't finished it yet. We published something which is a step along the way. There's a few considerations that perhaps need to be thought about more, like exit strategy. So project lifetimes might be often 30 years as talked about, but what happens after the end of that? So that's something that perhaps is going to be thought about more from now on. More about incorporating indigenous knowledge, indigenous and local knowledge, ILK, which is an best term. There's something in about data sovereignty and confidentiality already, but I think that can be unpacked more. But also we had a meeting in Cali of our task force and thought about the high-level principles and to some extent the design criteria, and said they've been well received, they're a great set of criteria, but how realistic are they? We probably can't name very many projects, if any, that meet all of them at the moment. So do they become just some theoretical thing which people ignore because it's unachievable, or do we try to, if you like, map a route to achieving them? So the next steps are really to define key use cases. So there's some examples given here on the right-hand side of the slide about different ways in which credits and credit-like things might be used. And then perhaps say, well, which of the principles really matter for each of these use cases? Which ones are perhaps more nice to have? Which ones can be works in progress? So trying to guide towards these things being actually usable. And then the final thing is right at the bottom, I talked about the IPBES monitoring assessment. This is really just to mention, again, as part of the funding that we've had. I was in Montreal last week, working as part of the new monitoring assessment from the IPBES, for those who don't know, is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a big mouthful. But the monitoring assessment, so they produce assessments like the IPCC does. Then there's one on monitoring at the moment, which is clearly relevant to what we're doing. So we'll try and achieve as much link up as possible between those. And then final slide is just to say thank you, and there's our contact details if you want to get in touch with us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Franzi. A few questions have already dropped into the Q&A section, so let's move on to that section of the webinar now. Now, you can ask your question live and in person. You should be able to turn your camera